Order, order. Welcome to this morning's session of the Transport Select Committee. It's a one-off session to question the National Infrastructure Commission on its work to provide the government with expert advice on major long-term infrastructure challenges. So could I ask our witnesses to introduce themselves?
Yes. John Armitt, Chairman of the National Infrastructure Commission.
Good to see you back.
Julia Prescot, Deputy Chair, and if I might add, it's also come from the private sector and have been very involved in transport investment across Europe, US and Africa.
Hello.
And Hannah Brown, Director of Policy at National Infrastructure Commission.
Thank you and welcome to the committee today. So the purpose of the session is to give the National Infrastructure Commission an opportunity to explain some of their reports, particularly on major transport infrastructure challenges that the government is dealing with and that we are very keen to have a look at. So can I start with your second National Infrastructure Assessment? You mention how the UK made transformational changes to the road network in the 60s and 70s, and you say it can do so again. What do you think should be the next transformational change on our transport from the transport infrastructure perspective? Sir John.
Well, I suppose one of the two fundamental points that we make in our report. One is the need for an integrated approach to transport. You tend to have two silos in the Department for Transport, one devoted to rail and one devoted to road. You've got others, airports and so on, but there's a much stronger sort of natural divide in a way because of interest, I suppose, between the rail and the road. And we argue that needs to be looked at in a much more integrated and strategic approach by the department. And then the second, which we've been calling for a long time, is more devolution of financial resources to combined authorities, and coming forward, of course, with the latest changes, the county councils with their increased powers under Labour's proposals. So devolution to enable people at a local level to make the critical decisions about local requirements in cities, which is absolutely critical for to increase the growth in the cities. The current approach of sort of having to bid for money, a lot of resources spent on those bids, then you don't win, and so that's money which you could have been spending on doing things which you've paid to consultants to put bids together for you. So really, I would argue to be more like almost the regulated sector, where you get at least 5-year settlements, so you know what you've got for the next 5 years to build the resources and the infrastructure that you need in your particular city and its environs.
You make a number of recommendations about cities and city regions, but also your recommendations also cover major infrastructure projects, and we'll come on to HS2 and others. But as a generality, is there a challenge there that in terms of long-term investment?
Well, there's a number of, I suppose there are a number of strategic challenges, and in terms of also strategic thinking. The reality is that the vast majority of journeys in this country are made by road, and with continued decarbonisation of road transport, that of course removes one of the traditional arguments that you should use a lot more rail, because rail is less polluting than road, but that will not be the case in the future. And as I say, the bulk of the population is totally reliant on road. The vast majority of journeys are made by car. I don't think people are going to leap out of their cars onto the trains, quite frankly, particularly if you're going on holiday with the family and you've got all the luggage. So I don't see any great significant growth in rail. There will be continued pressure on the roads, and therefore to ensure that we maintain a proper level of support and financial support for improving our road network. It's not a matter of building lots of new motorways, but we did a study which showed where all the key pinch points are across the country. There are a lot of them. They won't all be affordable, but the department needs to make some assessments on the economic benefits of each of those and decide which ones can be afforded in a reasonable period.
You have addressed increasing rail capacity where our rail network is severely constrained as well.
It's severely constrained in two particular areas, in the Midlands and the North. And so and they're both east-west basically. So you've got the east-west capacity, particularly from Liverpool across to places like Hull, and then you've got the Midlands capacity, which would have been improved with the eastern leg of HS2. That went by the board some time ago. In fact, to be fair, we said to government that if you've got limited resources, then focus on the western leg of HS2 and focus on the east-west connectivity, particularly in the north. And in the meantime, make what improvements you can, particularly on electrification on the eastern side of the country. Now we've got a further sort of reduction in the scale of HS2. That will not solve the Birmingham to Manchester capacity constraint. And as you all know, a number of discussions have been going on, led by the Andy Burnham and Andy Street and now his successor, in looking at what can be done. There are some proposals on the table as to how you could improve the capacity without necessarily doing the original HS2 full scope between Birmingham and Manchester.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, you had a question.
Yes, the first National Infrastructure Assessment was in 2018, and I believe that the final review of it was in 2023, which found that the last government's progress on its recommendations had been too slow, and it needed a long-term infrastructure policy. Now, this government is putting in an infrastructure plan, but what other learnings would you take from the difficulties the last government had in actually fulfilling the infrastructure that we need for this country?
I've said on a number of occasions that I think my principal concern has been that what we saw with the first assessment and what we've seen with many reports on individual aspects which we've done for the government since then, is that 70 to 80% of all our recommendations are accepted. So they're accepted in principle, but that doesn't create delivery. And so the difficult part then, and I accept it is difficult, is developing detailed policy. Policy can never be developed by one department. You finish up having to consult with 4 other departments in order to get your policy sort of brought forward. And I think the difficulty that the government has faced, and I suspect any government quite frankly faces, is actually going from strategic thinking to detailed policy, which is going to enable delivery. And the detailed policy, of course, as always, the devil is in the detail. If you take something like the decarbonisation of heat, particularly in homes, I mean, that's an incredibly problematic issue. You've got a whole series of different stakeholders, from private sector to individuals, and you've got freehold, leasehold, you've got standards which you may or may not wish to increase. You've got to make sure that you've got a fair distribution of cost, so that people are not being disadvantaged by what most inevitably is going to be some increase in cost. You know, how do you persuade somebody to, in fact, buy a heat pump at £13,000-15,000 compared with just replacing their gas boiler at £3,000? That requires a pretty dramatic intervention by government in saying, well, there will be no gas boilers for sale. That's pretty difficult to develop as a policy and to get accepted in a political sense. We've seen the same thing with cars, where governments bounce around as to what is their target date for not allowing the sale of petrol and diesel cars. And you're having to react to the political reality of these things. And I think the biggest challenge, frankly, for government is actually being more open and honest and more frank with the public about what the choices are, what the consequences are, which very often, if you take the challenge of sewage in rivers, do you want a perfectly clean river system? That is going to be expensive. That is going to be very difficult. It implies agricultural policy change. It implies a whole series of, it's not just about water, the water industry. So there are a whole series of challenges there which have to be addressed, some of which would not be popular. And if the increase in the bill for your water and sewage is too much, then people will rebel. I mean, we saw in Germany government complete reversal on heat pumps when in fact it tried to be too quick in implementing the change against opposition from the German public, and they did a reverse turn in about 12 months.
Okay. Ollie.
In your second National Assessment of Infrastructure report published in 2023, you made a number of recommendations in the sphere of transport. How well do you think the new government is doing so far in implementing them? I appreciate you've covered some of that in your introductions.
Anybody else want to have a go? Of the floor so far.
I think if I can say one of the real focus areas at the moment is development of the 10-year infrastructure strategy. And I think with the recommendations that we made in NIA2, both across the road and rail side, that those will be folded into that strategy. So it's certainly a question that people are, what is actually happening, but I think when the strategy is revealed and have a definite date for that at the moment, that will be the real steps forward in terms of our recommendations.
If I may add to that, we have also seen some progress in terms of devolution of transport funding and an increased focus on the CRSTS settlements with some of the major city regions. So that's certainly a step in the right direction. And then I think, as Julia said, we expect to see more when the infrastructure strategy comes out later at some point.
And thinking about governments that have gone by in terms of like the past work of the Commission, if you're thinking of sort of strategic themes more widely, if you were to choose a couple of areas that you think we as the Select Committee should give the new government a hard time on, to really probe on, given the wisdom of your experience, what might those areas be?
I mean, one area that we have always focused on is devolution and allowing city areas to actually have control over their own budgets. And as Hannah said, we have got the CRSTS there, but at the moment we just have that really for Manchester and Birmingham, and it would be good to see more definitive packages going into other cities at the next level, because we've always believed that locally is the best way of deciding upon your strategy, the needs of your population, and how you're going to support them. And so I think really continuing to look at that whole area of cities and how their transport networks are being developed is going to be a very important area.
Okay, thank you very much. We've touched on HS2, but the Chancellor's spoken about connectivity across the north instead of connecting the north to other regions. So do you think that's a sensible approach? If not, why not?
We did a specific report for the government on HS2 and the rail plan, if you like. And we gave them options, and we gave them a menu. And we said, depending on what you decide you can afford, these are the sort of things that you could or could not do. And basically we said, limit your, if you want to take a 25% increase on your budget, which was about 86 billion, we said you could increase that to about 100 billion. If you increased it to about 100 billion, then the best way to spend that would be to allocate some significant sums to East-West, which is where the pain is really felt. I mean, it takes you longer to get from Manchester to Leeds than it does from London to Brighton, considerably longer. And so we said, look, you really need to make improvements in that way to connect these cities. Connectivity between cities which are relatively adjacent to one another is going to help growth in the region. And we then said, we suggested that you delay on going forward with the eastern link of HS2, in order to get a better handle on the scope of works and what the potential scope and costs would be. And as you gradually develop those and you can see a way forward, then gradually bring things into play. In the meantime, there are improvements that you could make on the existing network, more electrification, particularly on the Midlands main line. And so, as I say, we set out a series of options. The government then chose something just under 100 billion, said it would not go ahead for the time being with the eastern leg. But what remains to be done is for the department, the government, to now produce a real integrated rail plan, which the supply side can actually see as something which is going to happen at this sort of rate over these years. It's not going to all happen at once. If it did, that'd be a problem. And so to set out a proper long-term plan for how the money is to be spent, and that is what is currently missing.
Okay.
So I was just going to add, and I think one of the points we also made is the necessity for an integrated transport plan. As Sir John said earlier, the split in between road and rail is illusory in a way. It's decisions that we make about journeys in one way or another. So the integrated transport plan, looking at the needs, road and rail together.
Which we believe is coming.
Which we believe is coming.
Lawrence, you had a question.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask a follow-up question about connectivity within the Midlands, and I think started to get onto this topic in answer to the previous question. But the Infrastructure Progress Review did say that there was a particular lack of rail journeys within the Midlands, east to west. So following the cancellation of the eastern leg, what do you think the most effective infrastructure response should be? Should it be the Midlands Rail Hub? Should it be other projects? And do you think there needs to be more political attention to connectivity within the Midlands as well as within the North?
The Midlands Rail Hub has been on the agenda for a long time, and is one which I think has certain better definition around it, and therefore we've always supported taking forward the Midlands Rail Hub and the opportunities that creates. I mean, Birmingham-Nottingham was going to be a very significant time saving on the journey with that particular link, and I still think that would be a sensible one to take forward as and when it's decided that the funds are available. It's a relatively cheaper part because of the nature of the landscape and so on. But Hannah, did you have any particular other points about the Midlands?
I think one of the other points to bring out is, in addition to what we've said on strategic transport, we've also called out Birmingham as a key priority city where we see increasing capacity constraints under a number of different scenarios in terms of sort of urban transport. So we highlighted it as a priority city for investment in mass transit to support growth in Birmingham and its wider city region. So that would also be a big priority, we feel, for that area.
Okay, thank you. One last question for now on HS2. Is there a risk, by bringing projects such as HS2 in-house to the DFT, do you think that will mitigate some of the risks on that project?
Well, I have to confess I've never been convinced by the governance structure of HS2. Maybe I'm influenced too much by my own experience, but having been chair of the Olympic Delivery Authority, where we were a separate standalone body with our own ability to hire and fire, with our own ability to get on and be given significant delegated powers, I think the retention of HS2 Limited within the Department of Transport can lead to too much oversight, quite frankly. And transport is an intensely political area, and I can understand it being very difficult for ministers to stand back when they're the ones who, at the end of the day, have to stand up here and defend what's happening. And so the closer they can get to the detail, the better. But on the other hand, that is it bound to lead to delays. It's bound to lead, I fear, to at times too much desire to actually meet every concern and objection and requirement for extra facilities within a scheme. I mean, I think it's 12,000 local agreements which HS2 has had to make after the hybrid bill. So you think, oh, we've got the hybrid bill, we can now get on with it. I'm sorry, guys, no, you can't. You've now got endless local negotiations to take place. And there is, of course, then the risk that in order to just make progress, you say okay. And every time you say okay, then unfortunately that's potentially more delay, but certainly extra cost. So I think it's not just about it being in-house, we're then starting to move into the whole debate around the planning regime and the nature of the planning regime, which at the moment we've done work on that as well, which has shown that these major projects are just taking longer and longer to get through the whole consenting process, not the initial consenting process, but the following consenting process at a local level. And as I say, I think there is a natural inevitability that when government, and by that I mean the whole machinery of government, is doing something, there is a desire to actually please people rather than a rather more private sector approach, which says, sorry, I have not got any more money. That is all we can afford. And I think government is not very good at saying that.
But when we were looking at the cost overruns at Public Accounts Committee before Christmas, many of those decisions were made before the decision to bring the oversight fully in-house. So am I right? You're suggesting actually the structure, the governance should actually go the other way and be more detached from government.
Well, there's a whole separate debate about just what are the cause of large projects overrunning. Yeah. And we've been very clear that part of the problem there is that there is not sufficient attention paid at the front end. And in the case of rail, arguably, and having been in charge of Network Rail, I know the desire of the railway industry to sort of provide a turn back in every possible facility for every possible eventuality, because this is our chance, guys, to design something which will be great for the next 100 years and meet all eventualities. But, if you do that, that's expensive. If you over-specify, we can have an argument all day, no doubt, about the speed which HS2 was designed for, faster than any other high-speed line in Europe. And whether that was really the right thing for the UK on a relatively short piece of railway. But inevitably that then dictates the alignment, dictates a straighter alignment, which then takes you through AOMBs, etc., which is then going to increase the cost of mitigation of dealing with the concerns, quite naturally, of places like the Chilterns. So I think, there was a desire to get going, and I would argue we moved too quickly in understanding exactly what would be the right route. I believe also that route was chosen largely internally within the department. I was involved in High Speed 1. On High Speed 1, there were many routes put out publicly at the beginning. It caused a lot of villages across the whole of Kent to protest. But at least there was then a couple of year debate, and at the end of which people are saying, please government, will you make up your mind about which route you're going to choose? Whereas if you do that internally and then produce a route which is dropped out onto the public, it's not surprising if you then get rather a strong pushback. So I think there's a lot to be learnt. We've been trying to learn it for the last 50 years, and I think one of our concerns is that we seem to continue to make the same mistakes. I was talking about this last night elsewhere. We know what is the best way to manage and develop large projects. But unfortunately, we don't always do it. And then it's not surprising that projects overrun on cost and go late.
I mean, much of the cost overrun was through those strategic changes that you've mentioned. but some is around cost management as well.
You get into the whole contracting philosophy, and there are, you could put 4 people in a room and get 4 different views about what is the ideal contracting philosophy. Julia and I even argue about it at times.
I think what I'm trying to get at is does being in-house in the DFT, or a model that you suggested, is there a difference in the way that costs are managed in those 2 different alternatives?
If I might comment, I mean, where I've seen projects mega projects being delivered successfully, there's been clear accountability, clear direction, and a very defined delivery path. And it's a question ultimately as to the desire and the efforts of DFT to come up with those types of solutions. And I think there's a danger that if that clear direction and push isn't followed, then again there are going to be problems. It's often it's often a very powerful and empowered chief executive who can get many of these issues through as an individual. And that's really, if that's what the solution, as it were, then whoever takes it on needs to really take on that solution.
Thank you. Ollie?
Turning to more sort of urban and suburban transport now, I suspect we will come back to HS2 though at some point. Your second national infrastructure assessment identified 4 key city regions where you feel initial investment should be prioritised, and we've discussed some of those already. How do you think the funding for those areas could be put to best use to achieve transport objectives?
Well, I would not presume to actually decide on behalf of the mayors and the local government of these cities what is best for their city. I think that is something which, again, they have to agree with their stakeholders and get the sort of support of their stakeholders, which is fundamentally the population and the businesses within those cities. And so the choices that you are faced with, there's always a desire to have a tram system. Trams are very expensive, and the infrastructure for them is expensive. So you've got debates about, well, do we really need a tram, or could we actually do with dedicated bus lanes? The thing about buses is they're immensely flexible. You can put services on and off at the drop of a hat. You can't do that with rail systems. But it's for them to decide what's their balance between walking, cycling, what allocation of space. I mean, when we went down to Bristol and talked to the members of the public in Bristol, you wouldn't be surprised, I suppose, to hear that what people fundamentally regard as right is fair, what they regard as fairness. And so we want a fair allocation of space between the different modes of travel within our city. We don't want it to be all one thing or all the other. And that, I think, is something we hear time and time again when you talk to the electorate. The concept of fairness is very important in terms of how big things are paid for, how space is allocated, what systems you use.
I think it's very commendable to see that you're following through on what you've said there in terms of the importance of devolving powers in your answer. But just to probe a little bit on some of the things you said there. So, yes, accepted, trams are more expensive than buses. But if we look at comparable European cities, tram systems do tend to dominate a lot more. Every large French city has one, as an example. Very common in Germany as well. And in many of these countries, cycling rates are higher as well. Do you think perhaps there is a risk that we write off those solutions too readily in the UK and think that they're somehow alien to our culture?
I think it's an affordability issue. I don't think you can build what you can't afford. And therefore, our analysis was that there were 4 cities, larger cities, where it made sense to do this. I mean, there is a 5th, of course, which is going along in Leeds. Who've been pursuing this objective for many, many years. And that's, at the end of the day, that's a decision for Leeds. I mean, having my own personal background at National Express, and having seen the flexibility of coach and bus, and it is by far the cheapest form of transport, then I think we should never avoid, or we should never ignore that opportunity. And as we move towards autonomy, You can imagine that guided busways, for example, which is essentially a tram, but the infrastructure is a lot cheaper and the vehicles are a lot cheaper. The challenge with any rail system is the weight, the safety expectations. If you have a rail accident, it's on the headlines. It stays on the headlines. If you have a coach accident, rightly or wrongly, it doesn't last on the headlines for very long. There is an acceptance, I think, of, because we all drive, we're all prepared to actually forgive somebody who's made a mistake driving, because we've been there, we know how easy it is to lose attention or whatever it might be. Whereas when you put your life in the hands of a third party, whether it's an airline or whether it's a railway system, then the expectation is rather greater.
But your own report did show the comparable cities, the level of population living within 30 minutes of the city centre by public transport, and surely the comparator cities are those cities that Ollie mentioned that have a significant amount of rapid transit options. And I get your point about the cost being higher, infrastructure, but over time, the unit cost per passenger, particularly because of the higher capacity, is far more efficient with trams than a traditional bus. Would I be right?
Yes, over time. And you're right. I mean, in many European cities, the tradition of the tram has... of course, we used to have trolley buses and all sorts of things, and those all went by the way. Whereas in Europe, they've stuck to their tram systems.
In some cases, brought in new ones, like modern ones as well. Yes.
I think we get, inevitably, we also, if you take the Edinburgh tram, we tend to be scarred by our experience of, again, what can go wrong with the costs of. And it's not the cost of the tram, to be fair. It tends to be the cost of the infrastructure. As soon as you start digging up streets, you don't know what you're going to find, quite frankly. And that's when difficulties set in. But I come back to my point. I think that at the end of the day, these are things which are going to have to be paid for, one way or the other, by the public at the end of the day. And they need to understand the balance between, am I going to pay in fares, or what is it going to do to taxation? Might that involve local taxation if you're talking about the ability of cities to raise money, which is an important one, which we've touched on at times. And therefore, I would argue that this is something where the right leadership, the right engagement with the public should enable you to come to the right solution.
I mean, we certainly advised in the area too that cities should be making their own contribution alongside central government contributions in order to make sure that there was an engagement and also a managing down of the use, for example, of private vehicles as public transport came in, because it's if you just take all the cars off the road and there's no way of getting around, then as a result you're obviously not going to make the public very happy. But you do need to have that relationship between the city contribution and central government contribution.
I think you make a really good point there. I mean, there's two things. What you said is interesting. Firstly, I think all the evidence suggests it's absolutely right to say that you've got to do significantly more carrot than you think before you do stick in order to get that modal shift. And secondly, a lot of these European cities we're talking about, things like tourist taxes are very common, 0.2 of a euro per night, etc., which all adds up over time. So.
Yes, I think New York, has 22 different taxes it can raise, where we have 2, an average city.
Scott.
Thank you, Chair. And on that point, Edinburgh should agree its tourist tax on Friday, which I'm looking forward to. So obviously are ambitious to invest in infrastructure. So how do we attract the funding to make that happen? What's the barriers just now, do you think?
I'm very happy to talk about that. I think that the word, if I go and talk to all the investors around, they come back and they say, we need to have investable schemes. And by that they mean if you're going to put private funding in, it is going to be often, for example, in partnership with public funding, to have forms of partnerships that actually allow risk to be spread between the parties, and it's going to have a robust revenue that actually will enable those investors to get their return. And also the other final thing is that the schemes have to be generally economic. And I think when we look at funding, we have funding from the public side, and we were talking about 28 billion a year as being a proposed figure for transport. I think we then looked at what the actual budgets are going to be, and it's very uncertain on the transport budget where we have at the moment with HS2, because it's still rather unclear. But that's not going to cover all the schemes. So I think we're going to have to go back and look at where we can integrate a degree of mixture of private finance, mixture of land value capture, TIF type structures, all together in order to make those investable schemes that I was talking about at the outset.
I think land value capture is always interesting to hear you mention that. But earlier on, we're talking about models where the department still has oversights of these projects. So it's difficult as you've got a project where the public sector partner probably wants lots of government co-funding, but they probably don't want a lot of government involvement in the scheme. Is that a stress, getting that balance right?
Well, I think what we've seen are very interesting developments, particularly in Wales, with the mutual investment model. And my Meridian, the fund I was formerly engaged with, is actually an investor there, so I would have to state that. But what you've got there is you've actually got an ownership model where the government has actually, on the A465 road, got a 15% ownership in the delivering company, the SPV. Mm-hmm. So therefore it's completely transparent in terms of engagement. The government is actually there. There is support, and it's, I think, an interesting way to look at the future, where people have been nervous that there have been too many black boxes where it's not been clear what's been going on. So if we can see more real partnership of that type, then I don't think that the private sector necessarily wants to say to the public sector, keep out the whole time.
Sorry.
They actually want to engage with them, though, in a very clear, transparent and informative way.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Are you seeing those other forms of investment being more readily accepted by particularly the Treasury, which is often cited as the block on new and different forms of investment?
In relation to that particular mutual investment model, it has obviously been accepted in Wales, and I think we're in early days at the moment at looking at its applicability across England. In fact, it was created out of the not-for-profit scheme that was used in Scotland, for example, for the delivery of the M74. So there has been a sort of continuity of the scheme, and we're waiting to really see what happens in England in relation to that.
Okay, because so many transport schemes, we're so wedded to what feels like annual spending reviews and 5-year plans, and 5 years is not enough for major infrastructure. So it sounds like you're seeing that the future is a little bit more. There are more options coming forward that are likely to be adopted. Would that be fair to say?
I think the longevity issue is one that is now being accepted in the context of infrastructure. And we are seeing in other sectors, such as in water, with the directly procured contracts that have 30-year contract periods, or early engagement in relation to electricity transmission lines, again, a greater move towards a longer-term period for investment and also repayment of that amortization of that investment over time. So the move is there. Are the models clearly delineated? Are they applicable? Are they investable across all sectors at the moment? I think we'll yet to be developed.
Okay, yeah, it's helpful. Okay, Alex, you wanted to picking up on local authorities again.
Yeah. So you've spoken quite a bit about the opportunities with devolving more budgets and powers to regional and local authorities when it comes to transport infrastructure. I wondered if you might want to expand on some of the opportunities, but also perhaps highlight some of the risks of taking that approach.
Well, in terms of the risk, and you can see this tension all the time, as always, there is the risk that you get a knee-jerk reaction to one thing which goes wrong. And some local authorities have not covered themselves in glory in recent years through their desire to invest, not necessarily in infrastructure, particularly in property, and other schemes which has got them into financial difficulty. So there's always this nervousness, quite understandably, I think, at the centre, is to there is this constant tension between, well, can we trust them from the centre to actually use this money sensibly and wisely. And I think it's on large schemes. I don't believe that the government will ever say to a city, yes, here you are, here's £3 billion, you can go and spend this. They would want to see quite a lot of detail before that money was released and understand that it was, it had been properly brought forward, going back to how do you develop significant schemes. On the other hand, the ability of a local authority to sort of decide, well, we need to spend 50 million here, 100 million there to open up parts of the city, may not be even transport, it may be in fact trying to create more open spaces, whatever it might be. That's the sort of thing I think where they need to have that freedom. This is not going to be a revolution, I'm sure, overnight. This, again, will be a case of gradually demonstrating. And this, again, is a continuity issue because, you could have one set of leaders followed a few years later by another set of leaders, and can you get that continuity? So that, again, then comes back to the executive competency within cities and local authorities. And, again, you're going to get a greater number of good people with the right experience wanting to work in these local authorities if they can see that there will be a continuity of regular significant financial support, so there are real things they're going to be able to do which are going to attract them to going into these local authorities. So I think it's a series of issues, and it's it's not expecting a sort of sudden total change, because I don't think any central government is ever going to be too happy with that, but they're going to want to see demonstrable capacity and capability coming forward from the cities to actually develop these schemes in their own way. In the way Manchester and Birmingham, of course, Manchester particularly have been the ones who've been most successful at this in the past 20 years, but our cities are so important. And certainly these larger significant cities which can then act as a magnet for opportunity business in the surrounding towns. It's another one of our arguments. You can't try and give a little bit to everyone. You've got to make some hard choices about which are the most significant cities, because they will become the magnet and will actually then enable growth within the surrounding towns. If going back to the 30-minute point, if you can actually get this good connectivity between towns and cities, and that's all going to help.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you spoke before and also in your report about CRSTS money, which has gone to MCAs. You've also been talking a lot today about kind of the need for clear leadership, proper delegations, accountability, perhaps removing things from the everyday politics. Do you see any contradiction then? Because obviously a pot of money like CRSTS is going to an MCA, and all the talk about that is about partnership working, consensus, plenty of committee meetings again and again. How do you make sure, therefore, that those kind of infrastructure projects that you would like to be given to those, for example, 4 major cities, actually have the ability to be delivered? Also bearing in mind, of course, that it's giving a capital pot to a transport authority that doesn't necessarily have any highways powers.
I mean, clearly there are contradictions in this. Would you in the ideal world just have a sort of Chinese approach where you've got a complete sort of directive power and almost dictatorial approach in which you just get on and do things regardless of anything else? That's never going to work here. and therefore we do have to recognise that this does require communication, it does require explanation, it does regard what has been described, the public have been described as stakeholders and shareholders, and I think that's quite a good way of thinking of the public. They are investing in this in one form or another because they do ultimately pay, and they have strong other interests in terms of environmental impacts or impacts on a community and so on. So they have to be recognised as that, and you have to deal with that. It's a matter of being able to show that you've listened, being able to show that you have taken not everything on board, but there is a reasonableness in the approach that you've taken, bearing in mind, as I say, going back to the public and saying, look, you cannot have the penny in the bun all the time. There are hard choices to make. It's your money we're spending. Let's get the right balance between what we're trying to do for the community, what we're trying to do for growth. Without employment, what do? The most important thing, to my mind, is that you're creating the opportunity for people to find good jobs. And that is where infrastructure and transport in particular is so important in creating those opportunities. If you can't offer jobs, then you've got a problem.
And could I make a differentiation as well between the various decision processes that are required to make a project happen right the way across the board? There does need to be a consensual approach to take something forward. But when you go into delivery mode, it's very important at the outset to, once you've made your decision, to stick with it, to not get sent one way or another, because that way inevitably increases costs. And I think one of the things that we actually said in our cost report is one of the major areas of real focus that we need to have is on the client and the sponsor relationship, and that delivery capacity that has to be very clear. Because, if somebody turns up, as we all know with any building project, somebody turns up and says, we'll have a little bit of that, and your builder looks at you and goes, yes, well, we need to add that. That's the thing that happens as much on infrastructure projects, and it needs to be avoided by having a very, very clear delivery stream, very clear accountability.
It sort of covers your next question.
It does, yes. But we'll go on to that anyway. So what is the National Infrastructure Commission's assessment of the DFT's ability to control costs on big infrastructure projects? Anyone?
You come back to the point that Julia was just making at the end. The most important person in any project is the client. It's not the contractor, it's not the designer, it's the client. The client has to understand what he values. You can't value everything equally. You've got to make some hard choices about what are the things I really value here. And those become my lodestar. And then you set the culture for the project. Nobody else can set the culture for a project other than the client. Which type of approach is he going to take?
Or she.
He or she, sorry. Not to get pulled off on that one. Too long in the game. That question of commercial approach, as Julia has been emphasising, is very important. And it might not necessarily be the same for every project, because there are some projects where the definition or the technology means that it's going to be very difficult to actually pin everything down. Hospitals are some of the most difficult things to do of all, because technology is moving so quickly. The expectation of what equipment is going to go in that hospital will be different in 2 years' time to what it is today as new opportunities come along. And medics quite naturally want to see the latest and the best. There are big discussions going on at the moment within the NHS about the nature of our hospitals and how best are they laid out, what is the most appropriate form. But you've got to make a decision on that. You have to make that decision and then stick to it. It's, the worst thing you can do as a client is to say, well, that's what I really value, and then 18 months later say, oh, well, actually, no, I've changed my mind. I'd rather value something else. So how the client is capable of actually directing his project teams. You get this sort of peculiar sort of definition between clients and sponsors and so on. But fundamentally, the person who's paying the money at the end of the day calls the tune, and he's got to decide how he wants that money to be spent and what he values. Does he want an iconic sort of architectural wonder? Well, okay, fine, but that comes at a price. Or is he prepared to accept something more mundane and more simple, which can be built more easily, more quickly, and undoubtedly will cost less? The only person who can decide that is the client, working on the advice of his technical experts, the architects, and so on. But it has to be a give and take between the two, and everyone has to collaborate in the outcome. If you don't get a collaborative approach in which everybody feels that they own the successful outcome of this, whether they're the contractors, whether they're designers, or the client, if they start sort of competing with one another, or if they start having too strong commercial tensions with one another, then you're likely to be heading for difficulty.
To what extent is your assessment that actually a lot of these projects are kind of under the budget is set incorrectly at the outset, and actually they cost what they were going to cost? And to what extent is actually money being wasted on projects because of poor management or changing your mind midway through?
If I could respond to that, I think that what we see in projects where decisions are made up front, where all the work is not seen as a sort of continuum, that if you're doing, for example, a construction contract on a design and build basis, then it's delivered on a design and build basis. If you just do it on a design and then a later build contract, there are so many opportunities for change to take place that it is better, and the best delivered contracts are those that are very clear from the outset as to what they hope to achieve. And it really does mean that it's quite difficult if you are constantly altering, constantly changing. And that's where those costs that you're talking about increase.
And Sir John, you talked about the client. Now, do you mean the client as the Secretary of State? Because you also earlier suggested that actually micromanagement of the of HS2 being in the DFT, i.e. under the Secretary of State, reporting weekly, I believe, or pretty regularly, there seems to be a contradiction in what you're saying.
I think what I'm saying is that if the Department of Transport is the fundamental funder of a road scheme, then the Department of Transport is the client for that road scheme. And if that means that the Secretary of State has to get involved, does he? I don't know.
She.
Question, she. More often, she these days. Then the Secretary of State, a lot of this is about personality. It's about trust.
Sorry, on HS2,
Yep.
does the
Well,
what's the
the
corollary?
original scope of work, so the original specification of what was expected to be achieved would have been led by Andrew Adonis. I mean, who was at the time the Minister for Rail, I think. And Andrew had a view. I mean, Andrew was very knowledgeable about the railways. He had a view about what he was trying to achieve, and that's fine.
But Secretaries of States have changed, and the scope of HS2
well, and the
has
problem is
changed.
every time the Secretary of State changes,
Yes.
everything else can,
Yes.
if you're not careful, change, and that's
Which
again
I presume is why you suggested that actually bringing the management of HS2 in-house, as the government have done,
puts it more at risk.
puts it at more risk. And you were actually suggesting the model that you used for the Olympic Park was a better one, which is actually taking it out once the specification is fixed.
The great thing about the Olympic Park is that you're providing sporting facilities for a number of sports, all of whom have their international committees who know exactly what they want, to the millimetre, because that affects the sport and that affects the ability to compete. So the pool has to be a particular depth. Everything is within what they have learned over many, many Olympic Games. So in that sense, you know exactly what it is you've got to build in terms of the operational way in which the sportsman is going to be able to. The more difficult thing is, what do we do with the spectators? You know, and at what scale are we going to have? And of course, that can be different for an Olympics than it will be in legacy. Hence, you had an aquatic centre at Stratford, which was capable of taking 18,000 people for the Olympics, but normal international swimming regatta will probably have 2,000 or 3,000. So we put temporary seating into that scheme and then took it away afterwards. But I mean, with the IOC, to be fair to them, you've got a client who knows pretty well exactly.
Okay, so they were the client. So we've gone into quite a lot of depth on rising costs through strategic change, not being clear what the spec is at the outset, and delivering it. But the other is there any more you want to say about cost management? Do you think that where costs within the project of HS2, and there are probably other examples, have overrun without in areas where there wasn't strategic change, do you feel that the HS2 management and the department have got a handle on that now?
Well, you've just got a new chief executive.
Yeah. Do you have confidence?
And I think no reason to doubt Mark's ability to get a grip. But like any new chief executive, he's wanting a few months to get his feet under the table and understand exactly what he's got and what it is that he's got to do. I mean, the success for HS2 over the next 3 years will be keeping it out in newspapers, you know, because it's going steadily along. It's, you know, it's doing what it says on the tin in terms of this is the progress we're going to make and this is the budget that we've got and we're sticking to. So clearly the first thing that he needs to do as the person who's the accounting officer is to be confident that that budget is the right one. And therefore, inevitably, there's probably a bit of a drains-up exercise going on at the moment to make sure that the budget is the right budget, and then feel that personal commitment as the CEO to deliver it.
Ollie, did you want to come in at this point?
Yes. I'd just like to explore a little more about some of the things you've been saying about learning from past mistakes and what we can learn from other countries. I sort of got three case studies in mind, some of which you've mentioned. So in terms of what you said about HS1, which I know you were heavily involved with, it's kind of out myself as a nerd here. I mean, it seems to me when travelling on it, from a sort of design and specification point of view, the track is, as you see on a French high-speed line, same signalling system, same electrification system, whereas as I understand it, HS2, just for whatever reason, decided to go in a very different direction in terms of some of that technical specification. Do you feel that was one of the reasons why HS1, from a cost management perspective, was a relative success in terms of like sticking to what we already knew worked rather than reinventing the wheel?
There was a very conscious decision by us on HS1 to not reinvent the wheel. This train was going to have travelled across Europe before it got to the UK, so why on earth would you have any different sort of electrical system to operate the train? They were the most expensive trains ever built, the Eurostar, because they had to operate originally on third rail, overhead, and also different voltages across Europe. But in my argument, very strongly always, is if you've got a technology which works and is proven, then you've got to have a very good reason to move away from it. And because highly likely it won't have been, won't have been tried and tested. The most difficult aspect on railways is actually the signalling. The signalling is it's the signals which control the railway. It's not the driver of the train. And of course we increase the capacity of the railway with cleverer and cleverer signalling systems. The danger there from my own experience is if you're not careful you become a guinea pig for the latest sort of software technology which has been developed by somebody who's keen to sell you that new technology. So again, you've got to make these choices about, do I really want the latest thing that's coming off the shelf, or in fact do I go with tried and tested? And the more you go with tried and tested, the more certainty you're going to have around the cost. HS2 have just awarded their major technical contracts. They've gone to European contractors who are very experienced in the systems that they will be providing. I think Siemens are one of the major suppliers. Yes, I mean, in a sense, when you look at the scale of high-speed rail which exists in Europe, tens of thousands of kilometres, we've got 100 kilometres at the moment. And this is our other challenge, that we do it very infrequently. The Spanish particularly, we're just churning them out, and there are more high-speed rail in Spain than France. I'd see no shame whatsoever in taking on board what clearly works, because you want something which is going to work. The passenger wants reliability first and foremost. That's the safe and reliable are the two key criteria. Another 5 or 10 minutes on the journey time is not, what really drives you to get on or not get on the train. It might be good for the economic arguments, which can be adopted about minutes saved and what's the value of a minute and so on. But passengers don't go in for that to any great degree. No, I think there's strong arguments for using existing technology, which we did on HS1. HS2's had a rougher ride, I think, in terms of the planning and all the extra requirements, and that, in a sense, is because you're looking at almost 30 years later, and the development and environmental expectation over that 30 years, which would have been less for us than it was for HS2. But no, and coming back to this wider point, I think the challenge so often for government and for ministers is the new minister prepared to actually carry on with his predecessor's work? Or is there the inevitable, I'm the new minister, I've got to show that, I'm here, I've got to show that I can make my own decisions, so let's have a pause on what was being done and considered, or had almost perhaps been signed off by the previous my predecessor, and now so let's have another drains up exercise, and off you go with further delay. All of which, to Julia's point, does not help the private sector in seeing the UK as being an attractive place to invest, or contractors to invest in their training, which is a key issue which we haven't talked about in the delivery of transport, the whole skills agenda in the UK.
Well, which we'll come on to. We'll come on to. Okay.
So the more certainty you can create, whether it's in your technical specs or whether it's in your policy decisions, the more that helps.
And if I could say something about the difference in sense between European contracting approaches and those in the UK, is that many more integrated design and build contracts are actually awarded. And in this country, we have seen design, as I've said before, followed by build. And that means that there is a split, and with that split there is usually a cost involved, because the builder can then come back and say, well, actually this design you've given me isn't going to work, so therefore I need to change it in order to get this price. Whereas if you have a design and build, and you'll find with a number of the European continental contractors that they will actually have in-house design and build, so that there's more of a separation between the two. So when you apply contracts, it's been easier to get a fix on those contracts at an earlier stage.
I also wonder if there's some learnings from what you were saying about HS1 and the route selection for East West Rail. So I will declare I did work for them 5 years ago. The challenge with East West Rail is they do seem to be doing what you've suggested in terms of consulting on a number of route options for the new bit of railway between Bedford and Cambridge, but they've done several non-statutory consultations, at least one statutory consultation, and the timescale for delivering that Bedford to Cambridge bit originally was going to be 2028, and now it's sort of mid-2030s, and it still seems to be rambling on about the route selection. What do you think are the learnings for East West Rail from some of these past projects?
Oh gosh, to be unpopular. You can go on forever listening to all the different perspectives, particularly in an area like around Cambridge. And it was the same around at the Oxford end. You've got a city surrounded by small villages. The small villages do not want to have the railway in their particular backyard. So everybody's got an angle on this. The closer you take your railway right into the city, the more your costs are going to go up, because the urban cost of building a railway is a lot higher than the rural. But no, I think it's I mean, we originally recommended, at the request of government, we looked into East West Rail. It was a project we then said, let's take that forward. It was actually a road and rail project. The road was knocked on the head pretty quickly.
Yes, it's
a lot of, again, I think partly because of concerns around villages. The rail scheme is going, we would all acknowledge, I think, rather more slowly than we would have liked, and it is taking a lot of consultation. And that requires somebody to, at the end of the day, say, right, enough's enough, guys. That's what we're going to do. Here's the line. The French do a lot of consultation before they put the line on the map. But then they put the line on the map and they say, well, we've listened to you all. Here is the line, and now we've got 12 months to kick it around. And at the end of 12 months, a decision will be made. And so, in a sense, it's on the one hand more consultative, perhaps, in some respects. On the other hand, it's more directive towards the back end. Julia, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, once you have your DUP in France, then nothing will move it, and it can stay there for a very long time.
You've covered off the last thing I was going to ask, then I'll hand back to the chair, because it was a really interesting case study of the South Europe Atlantic line in France, Tour to Bordeaux high-speed line. I've just been looking into it. 10 years of planning and consultation and dialogue, but then they went and built it in 5 for just 11 billion euros. 200 miles of track, 200 mile an hour line speed, some remodelling at the Bordeaux and Paris-Montparnasse end, and I've been on it. Paris to Bordeaux, 2 hours 5 minutes. Who can complain about that? So it's good to hear that you think we can learn from that, and because I completely agree. The Chinese approach isn't going to fit here, but hopefully France, different in some ways, similar in others. So that's really interesting to hear.
I mean, so just a final comment on that, and I have to express an interest here as being, again, my previous Meridian is now the main investor in Tour Bordeaux. One of the things that we always felt made it much more deliverable and cost-effective was that idea of having the single contractor, a single point of contract, no continual upgrading of design, all contracts let at the outside, within an envelope and a private sector envelope, which meant if you made any change, you had to go out and consult X numbers of banks, X numbers of investors. And so therefore you innovated rather than making the change. And I think that's a really important point going forward, that if you have an envelope, you innovate within the envelope.
Okay, thank you. And just before we continue, I just need to correct an impression I may have made. The issue of HS2 being more managed in-house in the DFT was a suggestion. There hasn't actually been any structural change to those relationships, so apologies for any impression that I made. Baggy.
Okay, brilliant. Just before I go on to variability of cost, just going back to a point you made, Sir John, about the client setting priorities and also areas where they're prepared to accept some compromise. Day 1, hour 1 of any project management course will say cost, scope and time. You can't have all of it. You've got to compromise somewhere. And I've got this bugbear, and it's probably from a previous role at the council as well. With some public sector projects, we seem to put a price on it right at the beginning, without getting any tendering, without going out for having received any quotes back. Do you think that helps or that hinders the perception of project delivery?
No, I mean, it clearly hinders. The quicker the sooner you try and land on a price, the greater the risk that you're going to get it wrong. Now, there is a very cynical view, which people will have acknowledged in the past, which is that the only way you'll get your project signed off is by having a low projected cost. And then once we've got it signed off, guys, and we're building, okay, it might cost more, but at least we've managed to get our project across the line. Whereas if we were up front about what we thought the real potential risks and costs might be, then we may never get it signed off. Now, I'm not advocating that as an approach, because I think in the longer term that carries greater risks. So I think you should be open and frank and understand. And if you can understand what the costs are and that they're too great for what you can afford, then the simple question is, well, what can I do for what I can afford? How can I meet the outcomes that I'm looking to achieve in the most cost-effective way, rather than in the most, if you like, the most glamorous way? And your point, do you want time, cost, or quality? Well, you can't have all three in equal buckets. The Olympics was very simple. Time was of the essence. Everything, you've got a strict opening date. That is brilliant because that drives everything else. But if you haven't got that strict opening date and people feel a bit casual about the programme, then there's going to be a greater tendency to interfere in or change your mind about what your scope might be and how you value other aspects. But I think the challenge for government is that quite naturally most of the time cost is probably the biggest concern for government because it's spending public money. It wants to show that it's using that money as effectively as possible, and the more it can build to a cost, the better. I mean, on railways, electrification is a very interesting example where we sort of start, stop. If you look at the comparison between rail electrification investment in Germany and the UK, in Germany it's a flat line. It's a steady amount of money for 30 years. This is what we're going to spend on electrification. If you look at ours, then you're looking at a mountain range of up, down. And so much of that up, down is driven by knee-jerk reactions. Oh, that one didn't go very well. Right, let's stop Network Rail. Don't do any more electrifications. We need to understand what went wrong on the last one. Another 2 years goes by, and so the industry drifts away. You lose some of your skill base and so on, and then you've got to start from square one again.
Invest more. Okay. Yeah. Moving on to variability of cost then. So your cost drivers report talks about variability of cost and the difference, quite a wide range, both transport infrastructure generally and roads. Why do you think that is, and what's the reasons behind it?
I mean, what we discovered, because we were asked to do an international comparison, not just a sectoral comparison, and what the research which was done for us by two different sets of consultants showed was that in general we were within about 10% of international norms. Sometimes we were better, sometimes we were worse. The big differences were in the very large rail schemes, and if I remember rightly, in nuclear, I think as well. Although nuclear tends to be pretty difficult everywhere, but to be in the UK, we certainly, again, because we hardly ever build them, and so again, you've not got that same continuity that you have that you have had in other countries. On general building work, then the UK stands pretty much the same as other countries in terms of its cost base. But it's in civil engineering where you tend to see the bigger differences, and on the very large civil engineering projects, and that I think comes back to some of the things we've already discussed today about how we tackle those very large schemes and the amount we're prepared to invest at the front end to minimise the risks. You can start building a road having done 10 boreholes along your 20-mile route, or you could do it with 100 boreholes. If you do 100 boreholes, yes, that's a bit more expensive, but at least you've got a really proper understanding of the ground conditions you're going to face. So many of these schemes, the extra cost arises in the ground, and it's the ground, of course, whether it's digging up the high street in a town or whether it's going across a natural landscape where you can find the unexpected challenges if you don't have enough information at the front end.
And I think there's also the pipeline issue as well, which is that if you look at the way in which infrastructure has been procured, again, it goes back to John's mountain ranges. We get very enthusiastic and then stop, whereas if you look, for example, at Spanish high-speed rail, that has been continually procured at a steady rate over many years. And what that does to companies is I can look at my business plan as a company going forward. I'll know these tenders are coming forward. I might not win all of them, but if I lose one, I know I've got the next one to do. So therefore, I invest in skills, and I also invest in whatever technology is going to be required to make me win the next one. And so the impact of a pipeline cannot be underestimated. And certainly under the infrastructure strategy, we very much hoped that a very clear pipeline would come out as a result with beneficial impacts on costs and also links into various elements of the industrial strategy.
So on the variability point again, though, I know there was international comparators, but even within the UK we're saying there's quite a bit of variability if you're building a road down south or up north. What drives the variability within the UK then?
It would usually be the nature of the client and the nature of the procurement method, and also the contracting. Again, you know, I've already given the example as if you do design and then build, you're going to have an interface that's going to cost money. If you have design and build contracts at the same time, then that interface isn't going to exist. So you might have different contractual approaches in relation to what are apparently similar forms of infrastructure.
And you see some benefits of setting some sort of standards government-wise where regions would follow that? Would that be...
I absolutely. I mean, there's a great danger in setting a standard that then you increase small costs because you've actually got to make sure everybody's fulfilling the standard. But on the other hand, if you take and you say what is the most applicable approach to this particular contract and where am I going to get the best value for money and the most constrained costs, and actually have that come through again and again in terms of procurement.
Catherine.
I think one of the things that's been mentioned impacting upon costs is skills, and skills is something that I have been concerned about for a while, and there are massive skill shortages, yes, in the transport sector, but across sectors. Can I ask you about what impact that has on not just cost, but potentially even feasibility of schemes? And you'd also mentioned working cross-department, and how do we better do that to address the huge skill shortages that have been allowed to exist and not be resolved?
Skills, let's make the point that as the NIC we have always said there are an enormous number of interested parties, organisations and people with an opinion on skills in the UK. Are we going to add anything much to the benefit of mankind by deciding to do a piece on skills? And our answer has always been no. So as the NIC we have never done a detailed piece of work on skills availability and so on. I have personal views on it because I was chairman of City and Guilds for a number of years. And so I've seen, for example, the impact of the apprenticeship levy, which in fact resulted in a decline in the number of apprentices. And not surprisingly, businesses actually using that money in the wider training gambit. So let's go and train our managers to be better managers. That was not the intention of the levy.
Yep.
And equally, the Big Four and others saying, oh yes, well let's have degree apprenticeships. And degree apprenticeships are quite attractive, of course, to a young person if you can get a degree and be paid for 3 or 4 years. And so degree apprenticeships, we've seen an increase in the last few years, and I think degree apprenticeships are very, very good. That sort of mixture of academic and practical training. But the real challenge for us, I think, as a country is the fact that we've got 1 million young people who are in what are called the NEET category. They're neither in education, training or work. And that's our major challenge, and that is much more complex, I think, and is going back into the education system then, and is the education system working in the best possible way to deliver 16 to 18-year-olds who are ready to move into one of the, either directly into work, into training, or into further education, and that's a very big challenge. I mean, clearly the industry itself was able for many, many years to rely upon labour coming in from Eastern Europe, particularly skilled labour, and that reduced the need for the contractors to do as much training as otherwise they might have done. The government has always got the ability to impose a training requirement within its contract forms, and we had a 3% requirement at the Olympics, that 3% of everybody a contractor was employing had to be in training, but it's certainly, we are nowhere near as effective as other countries are and have been, and then you move on to the skills required at the more senior levels or the professional levels. Again, you then come back to the continuity debate, and well, where will I go? There's more opportunity, more continuity in this sector than there would be in the infrastructure and construction industry. And as I said about local authorities, if they haven't got a steady stream of investable projects to use Julia's phrase, and they're going to struggle to attract the right people to come in and work for them rather than stick down in London, get out into the other cities.
I think that's what we're coming on to.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, Scott.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think there's massive challenges for the industry in this period where there's immigration is a little bit harder into the UK now. So now companies are having to train staff up, and this does take time. So it's massive in this period. I wanted to return to design and build contracts, Julia, if you don't mind. So I think there's a variation of this where the client and the contractor work together, and if it's delivered under budget, the contractor benefits directly financially, and if it's slightly over budget, the contractor's penalised slightly. So we use that, since Sir John mentioned the tram in Edinburgh, the phase 2 of that, that's what we used to deliver that. So I think it worked quite well. Is there any evidence that works well generally, or is that a bit of an anomaly? Sorry, I'm assuming you're an expert in this.
We used it totally pretty well on the Olympics. Oh. They were all what is called the NIC target form price of contract, where they're largely design and build. Nearly all the major projects were design and build on the Olympics, and the contractor and the designer between them, the contractor particularly, because contractors tending to take the major risk here, can incentivise the designer. I've done that and said to the designer, look, if for every pound of material cost that you can save me in this, let's split it 50-50. On the Olympics, we took 97% of the risk. We only left 3% with the contractors on the overrun of costs. The argument there was that let's have all the brain power focused on delivering on time and keeping below the budget rather than on writing claims for things which might have been unexpected and gone wrong. So there are a lot of people, I think, today who would argue that the combination of design and build together with the right incentives and you can spend quite a lot of time arguing about the incentives, of course, but at least you're having that debate at the beginning rather than for 3 years after the contract's finished arguing about claims. But you've got to get the target right, you've got to get the incentives right. And just to reinforce Julia's point, the building industry, the construction industry, is the only one, really, which separates design from manufacture. It's manufacture. We call it construction, but fundamentally it's manufacture. Can you imagine a car? Can you imagine Ford or Toyota or anybody else actually separating their designers in a totally separate company from the one that's putting the car together? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And yet in the UK, particularly compared with our European colleagues, I mean, the European contractors are doing an awful lot of work here now. They're bigger, they can take more risk, and they do have this beauty of having these major in-house design capability. So there's this constant understanding between those who've got to build it and those who are designing it on what makes for a cost-productive, efficient method of building.
Yeah, and even if it's not in-house, often it's consortiums that are formed around these projects, which I think works as well.
Yeah. And I think that another feature that we see is the different size in balance sheet, and so therefore the capacity to take risk in relation to the European contractors, because the UK construction industry is very fragmented and is also doesn't have those same type of balance sheet capacity to take on risk and manage that risk in its own way. But in the context of your original question with in relation to outcomes, what's good is having a target. What's good is making sure people are incentivised, whether or not it's a pain share, gain share structure, as the type that you saw in Edinburgh. In all cases, maybe it's not as defined as that, but yes, it's so important to have that target so that you know what you started from.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so your examples are very interesting, particularly Sir John, but we do need to speed up a bit with your responses, if that's okay. Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll keep it brief. One common criticism of government transport planning is that strategic decisions across modes are not always well integrated with each other, so investment in rail and road, for example, and those decisions don't always have a clear relationship with government's wider strategic objective, whether that's regional rebalancing or decarbonisation. So do you think that is fair criticism? And if so, what do you think the best way is for government to improve its strategic clarity when it comes to transport infrastructure?
I mean, I think one of the things that certainly we saw in the NIA2 was the proposition that decision-making on strategy is actually made on the basis of connectivity benefits and economic benefits across the country, rather than the rather more piecemeal approach that we've seen to date. And I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about the sort of strategy proposals that we came up with in the.
So I think what we said in NIA2 very much mirrors your question, that we think that we should move towards an approach where we have a long-term integrated intermodal strategic transport strategy that is based on clear economic rationale, which brings together decisions on road and rail and surface transport, and also takes the opportunity to integrate between interurban networks and the urban networks, because as policy people we like to see the separation, but as somebody driving a car or getting a train, you just want to be able to get to where you want to go. So that was certainly the point we made in NIA2. I think we would hope that moves towards a 10-year infrastructure strategy would give that longer term line of sight, but again it comes back to commitment around delivery as well, and how you make it stick.
And the timing is another issue, because obviously you've got RIS 3 coming out very shortly, and our proposals really that we looked into CP8 and RIS 4 as looking at these integrated schemes going forward into the late 2020s and 2030s, because we're on a trajectory at the moment. And
okay, thank you.
Hannah, your point and just now, and also Julia, your earlier points where you said the importance of pipeline, the importance of a pipeline cannot be underestimated. Now, as you know, we've launched our inquiry into investment pipelines, and hoping that NIC will contribute to that. But I'd be interested to know why you think successive governments haven't been better at planning pipelines. Is it because of a turnover of ministers and a change of political direction, or do you think the Treasury haven't been sufficiently willing to let the DfT plan far enough ahead? What are your views on that?
It's very difficult looking at history, isn't it, and the decisions that were made and why they were made. Really, you can only look at the outcomes, and that has been a very a staccato approach in terms of making sure that we have a continual successive form of projects coming through. It's often political. It's
political rather than Treasury constraints, in your view.
I think a lot of it has been political, because again, a lot of these pipelines, in a strategic sense, come up very early in terms of the thinking and where people want developments to take, rather than necessarily starting at a Treasury level. So it's actually having that political commitment. And I think when we have seen pipelines, it's often because there is a really strong political commitment. I mean, quite an old example now is really in Ireland, where in the 2000s, big pipeline of roads came out because they were so determined that the road network needed to be upgraded. All at the same time, same thing happened in Norway, a whole series of projects came out. And it's actually having that initial political commitment. We want to make change, and we want to do this continually, that really makes the difference, in my humble opinion.
Catherine.
Further on the need for pipelines when it comes to achieving what we want to achieve on infrastructure. You gave the example of Spanish high speed. I think that electrification in Germany is another. What can we learn from other countries when it comes to pipelines being really useful in achieving real progress on infrastructure?
I think, again, going back to what Hannah was saying about this approach, having an integrated approach, once you have decided what that integrated approach is, you're then going to be saying, well, what do I do to achieve it? And you can look, I mean, in this NIA2, there's a map that looks sort of like disconnected bits of spaghetti on it. But actually, if you take each example, you put them into a pipeline, the chances are you will have significant economic impact, because those individual pieces were the pieces we identified as having the most economic potential by increasing connectivity between cities, and therefore the economic growth that was going to come from that.
I think you started to set this out, but why do you think we haven't done it today? What have been the barriers, and what has been the impact on the supply chain of our failure to do so?
Well, going back to the barriers again, I really reiterate my previous answer, saying that I don't think there's been enough political commitment to make those real economic connectivity upgrades. The impact on the supply chain has been that there has been really no forward planning. And the supply chain, we live in a global competitive market. The supply chain has said, well, shall I put my resource in this direction? Shall I put my resources in that direction? And because the pipeline hasn't been there, the supply chain hasn't been able to respond to it. As a company, I'm not going to look a lot of money into either attracting skills or technological innovations if I don't know what the likely contracts are that I'm going to be able to bid for and succeed. It just doesn't make sense in terms of in corporate sense.
Would you be hopeful with the plans being made for an industrial strategy and infrastructure strategy that we will see those pipelines, and that therefore we will be giving that kind of confidence to the supply chain?
Well, I have to say yes, because I am an optimist in these matters. My colleague might not agree, but I genuinely think that we've got to use the strategy is not in and of itself anything other than a guidance to a pipeline being created, to delivery happening, to the shovels going into the ground. And that's what has to be driven. We can't just sit there and say, oh, look, we've got a strategy, because ultimately that doesn't relate to a shovel going anywhere.
As I said earlier, strategy is the starting point. Strategy has to be followed by a detailed policy, which can then feed into the ability to allocate money and deliver. We've had the pipeline for a long time. The government's been publishing a pipeline for the last 10 years, probably, with about 500 projects in it. But if you look at the 500 projects, only about a third of them ever had money behind them. I think,
which goes back to the question about what's the Treasury's role in this.
Well, I think it's. I mean, look at the challenges that the Treasury is facing this week.
Okay.
It is very. I'm the first to be critical of, if you like, short-term decision-making by ministers in order to deal with the crisis of today. But at the end of the day, with the amount of pressure that you can see coming on to politicians because of the latest set of figures, because of the latest forecasts, etc., you can have as we've seen, you can have a view of what your spending review is going to be and what your budget is going to be 3 months ago. It'll be a different view today.
Maybe I shouldn't have used the word Treasury, but the investment mechanisms, because
it depends then. But yes, but if you're publicly financing, then that is one set of criteria. If you can use more private financing and you can show to the private sector that you are committed to these schemes and that you are going to bring them forward, that they are going to go into the machine and the private sector, because in the first place, the private sector is going to have to bid for them because different financial groups and so on will want to compete. But if you, we've seen the whole difficulty that we've had with social infrastructure in terms of hospitals. We go back to 2008, where PFI suddenly became, you must not, the words must not cross my lips sort of thing, whereas before that we'd seen it as being a very important mechanism for delivery. And that was not necessarily about the construction period, it was about the operational period. So you then say, well, okay, let's learn the lessons of what's gone wrong within the operational side of these private hospitals, and let's put that right. Let's not say we're not going to have any more private finance going into hospitals when we have such a desperate need for hospitals. So I think we have a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater too often, rather than saying, okay, that went wrong, now let's learn as to why it went wrong and let's put that right, rather than saying we're not just going to adopt that approach in future.
Thank you.
Final thing on pipelines, if I can. I think you singled out, I believe, in electrification as something that could really benefit from pipelines. Can pipelines have work going forward? Can I ask you a little bit more about why in particular you think it would work for that and what you would want to see?
I mean, I think on electrification, I think what we're trying to make the point there is particularly the comparator point in relation to the lower costs that we've seen in Germany in relation to having that pipeline because of the replicability. So I don't think it's the only sector that we would point out as being able to benefit from having very clear pipelines, but it was one with a very clear comparator, and also because of the delays in electrification, then it's one that we've got to really try and push through as well going forwards.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Baggy.
Oh.
Planning.
Okay, planning, yes, planning consent. So, yeah, our favourite topic. So various obstacles in the planning system which prevent the delivery of infrastructure projects, particularly around transport. So could you just sort of describe what you think the major obstacles are, but more importantly, what could be done to work through them?
Well, our analysis, which we were asked to do on this, showed that in the last 12 years, we've gone from an average time of just over 2 years for a what's called a nationally significant infrastructure project, an NSIP project, to 4 years. So we've gone from 2.5 years to 4 years in 10 years. More alarmingly, the number of judicial reviews has gone from something like 10% to 57%. So the proportion of schemes which are being subject to judicial review has gone up very significantly. A lot of the delays are at the front end, and of course if you believe that you're going to be faced with judicial review, then quite naturally as a designer you will try and prejudge all those things which might come up as objections and say, well, let's cover them off, so let's design into the scheme from the get-go what we need to do to avoid that judicial review. So you're building in cost all the time from the beginning in the belief that you might be challenged on something. To be fair to the inspectorate, they have been pretty good at delivering their conclusions within the 6-month period that they're given. They don't accept a project for their consideration until it can be demonstrated by the developer promoter that in fact he has done sufficient pre-consultation. And it's actually at the pre-consultation phase where we've seen the biggest increase in time, because as I say, people are consulting more and more, having to deal with more and more statutory authorities. The number of statutory authorities who have to be consulted and all brought into line and take their place, and the time that takes is very significant. Ministers have been pretty good, by and large, at making their decisions within the time frame that they're given. I mean, it's a relatively short time frame, so even if it doubles, it's a year rather than 6 months that they may take. It's the front end where the biggest challenge is occurring, and it's an interesting dilemma, really, because going back to our point about France, where in fact they do spend more time at the consultation stage, but then they have a more rigorous final decision phase. Our final rigorous decision stage is being particularly hit by judicial reviews. There's a separate report which has come out recently by a learned member of the legal society, a judge who has made certain recommendations about that. Should you only be allowed, because you can go back for 3 judicial reviews on the same point. So there's should we consider it to be just 1, or do we compromise at 2? That sort of debate will be going on at the moment. It's for the private investors, not knowing when you're going to actually get the consent and how long you're going to be waiting, when you could be getting on with doing it somewhere else in another country much more quickly. It's one of the challenges that we face. I don't it's easy to say that, we're going to sort of turn it on its head. To be fair, I don't think that's going to be as easy as we might want it to be if we are trying to take public opinion with us. I think the public would be sympathetic in many respects to saying this is all taking too long, it's costing us too much money to do it, etc. It again comes back to the point I made earlier about the need for us to have a bigger public conversation about some of these things.
I mean, if I could add to that as well, we have seen delays in national policy statements, which are clearly the drivers behind the interpretation that is given. There have been some improvements there, but certainly one of our recommendations was to look at 5-year revisions of national policy statements. Some of them haven't been revised for a very long time, and then also modular updates to those MPSs as well, so that as various changes in law taking place, they are reflected, because I think certainly on the transport side, some of the delays have been because of there has not actually been an update in relation to the planning statements and the policy statements. The other area is data. There's a huge amount of repetition of data recovery in terms of making planning decisions, which costs an awful lot of money. And as an individual investor, say in a scheme or even on the public sector side, collecting data over and over again is not very helpful, and we propose libraries of data, which is, again, I believe under consideration. And then there's also a relationship between who's going to pay for all of this so that we can get those statutory consultees moving more quickly. So having compulsory service level agreements with developers is another key part of what we're looking at generally, just to try and push the process forward. But we can't overcome it. We can't be, I think it's been described as the Chinese approach. We have to be democratic clearly in these decisions. But above and beyond all of that, we need to have the conversation to be very clear that there are benefits to these communities. And it's not just a question of, a 3-lane, 6-lane motorway going past them. And if that is financial, then that is financial. If there are other ways that benefits can be given, I think we need to be clear about those as well. And going back to the French, they do that very well.
Interesting.
So if the government was to prioritise any reforms to speed up particularly transport infrastructure projects, have you got any thoughts on what that would be?
My feeling would be a mixture of making sure you're integrating policy into those national policy statements quickly enough on one side, and then making sure that the communities that were being affected had sufficient benefits on the other side. And if you do both ends, I think whether or not we can halve it is halve the planning times is another point, but I do think we need to make an effort to do that, because otherwise it will be increasingly difficult to develop some of these transport projects.
There is an interesting debate, and we've made out recommendations again on this in our planning report about the need for appropriate compensation, whether it's to communities, whether it's to individuals. This is something which we do all the time in housing with what's called Section 106, but in infrastructure it's equally applicable. You could argue that if you are being particularly disturbed, the other example, of course, will be we hear at the moment is the extension of the grid and the pylons and the lines required. That costs a lot more money to put it underground, so why not compensate people with lower electricity bills if they're going to be affected by this for the next 20 years? And I think we often see there's something wrong with this. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with it at all if you can actually offer somebody some compensation for some inconvenience that they are incurring, or if you can offer them better community opportunities and things which they would like to have built to make it more acceptable to their community. Okay, we've got a downside here, but we've got a significant upside here. And the scale of these projects, you can do a lot on the community level without having any significant impact on the cost of the project itself. So there are lots of ways of addressing this. The government's recently talked about trying to take a more spatial approach to environmental considerations, which will be interesting to see how that develops, because at the moment each scheme has to produce its own environmental statement, which involves thousands and thousands sometimes of pages of analysis. And yet it's only sort of 10 miles from another scheme down the road where similar environmental conditions have been had to be addressed. So why can't we take what's been learnt here and just simply plug it in over here rather than start all over again with another set of environmental considerations being consulted on and written up at great length?
Okay, thanks, Maggie. Catherine?
We talked about the 10-year infrastructure strategy being a starting point, albeit an essential starting point. What would you like to see in it from a transport perspective?
I think what we have looked at in NIE2 provides a series of recommendations that we would really like to see in that. I mean, it's a document. A lot of work was done. We thought about the strategy. That is what the NIC has been extremely good about, thinking about that longer term strategy. And we would like to see those. And I don't know if any highlights, Hannah, that you wanted to.
I think it goes back to many of the things that we've discussed today. So continuing the further progress on devolution, a strategic long-term plan for investment in the transport networks that gives visibility to the pipeline, that really prioritises, importantly, maintenance and renewal, then also looks at the recommendations that we put out in the assessment on investment in improving urban networks, because we believe that really driving cities, the major cities in the UK, as engines of growth for them and for the wider regions is important, and then also having an economically I always say this wrong. A strategic long-term strategic interurban intermodal strategy based on economic rationale that is affordable and deliverable would be the core recommendations that we would that we made in NIA2 and that we'd hope would come forward in the infrastructure strategy.
So really the focus on interurban and making sure we're making economic decisions that really help connectivity, and intra-urban to make sure that particularly in the larger centres the agglomeration benefits from having better connectivity within those centres are also reflected in the transport strategy.
We have put a very strong emphasis on maintenance. And again, you can see that for local government particularly, this is a little bit hand to mouth. How much money have I got this year? Will I have the same amount next year? Can I actually set up a really proper long-term approach to my maintenance regime with the right equipment, the right people, etc. And to the public, this is one of the most important issues. I mean, we have all experienced around this table, I'm sure, the increase in potholes, not only on our rural roads, but particularly on even some of our main motorways, in a terrible state in certain areas. If you don't maintain your infrastructure, it will only come and bite you later on with even bigger costs. And so I can't emphasise enough the need to have a long-term approach of giving, again, devolved finance to particularly the local authorities. I mean, Highways England need it as well, Network Rail need it. And Germany's in a terrible state at the moment with its railways because they've had underinvestment and they've lost their punctuality reputation. So maintenance should not be seen as an afterthought. I think maintenance should be seen as one of the prime ingredients in this long-term strategy.
And if I could also link that to resilience and climate resilience, that maintenance and renewal factor is going to be extremely important to making sure that we have we're upping our levels of protection in relation to climate change. And so it's all part of a continuum to look not only at the future, but also look what we've got at the moment and make sure it's resilient enough.
And what potential do you see for the infrastructure strategy supporting the industrial strategy?
They will need to be closely interlinked, because if we have an infrastructure strategy that is not backed up by that focus on skills, technology providers going forward, then we're going to have that degree of dislocation that means that, I'm not saying the industrial strategy wouldn't happen, I'm not saying the infrastructure strategy isn't going to happen, but it's take longer and be more expensive. We've talked about skills already. We've got to make sure that that interplay works effectively.
Okay, thank you. Lawrence?
A number of major transport projects are currently under review, and as you know, it's been claimed that some of those projects were not sufficiently taken to a maturity of design or costed or funded, which you may or may not wish to comment on. But as we await the outcomes of that review, how do you think the government should be prioritising which inherited projects do or do not go ahead?
I think, as all has been said by Hannah, fundamentally we're looking at economic growth. And so the significant criteria should be which projects are going to contribute the most to actually ensuring economic growth around our key cities, or growth on our main corridors. One of the biggest challenges at the moment is, and which has been under constant review, of course, is the Lower Thames crossing. Which if anybody's been to Dartford and experienced the challenges of the two Dartford crossings at the moment, the LTC is clearly a very important and very necessary project. It's very expensive. And that's an opportunity to actually come back and say, well, why don't we do this on a privately financed basis? Because you can put all three crossings together in a bundle and manage the flow of traffic across the three through a single set of a single management. But I think the fundamental point is, let's be confident that we're putting the money in the projects which are going to have the most economic impact and that give the most opportunity for certainty around industries. I mean, coming back to the industrial strategy, if we know from a spatial point of view that these are the parts of the country where we're going to be developing hydrogen, where we're going to be developing carbon capture, where we're going to have our steel industry, whatever these industries are, that gives you the first clue as to where the connectivity needs to be the best according to those challenges of your infrastructure strategy. The industrial strategy almost is the top level. It's the infrastructure strategy should support the industrial strategy.
And a short follow-up, if I may. Do you think that our ability to project that contribution to economic growth, particularly when we're comparing different modes, is sufficiently well developed? Or is there further work on the modelling that the Department and the Treasury should be doing?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, we're not short of models. Hannah, you any comments on modelling?
No, I think a model will only show you what you've put into it, really. But I think the one thing that we have consistently said is that projects should only be committed to when they are robust to a range of plausible futures, so that you've built the response, you've built the impact of uncertainty into that design process. So I think that's probably where we would come out, is that it's about making sure that you've considered the outputs of the different models, and the value for money for this project is true under a range of alternative scenarios.
I mean, there is no perfect solution, but if we just wait for the perfect solution to turn up, again, those shovels aren't going to go in the ground. I think there's an issue of risk. And I think it's taking a structured and modelled risk, but there's still an issue of risk and a question of just do it at the end.
All models are wrong, but some models are useful.
Precisely, very well put.
Can I just move on to EV charging infrastructure, which, if you take it as a whole, you could say is a major infrastructure project. There are considerable concerns, particularly from the vehicle manufacturing side, on the concerns about the rollout of the EV charging infrastructure. And I know you've done some work on this. What do you see as the major barriers, and what needs to happen to speed things up?
I probably should express an interest. I do sit on the board of Aligo, which is an EV charging company. So,
Who better to talk about it? I think we set out. We set out some years ago that we thought there was at least 300,000, probably 500,000 charge points needed. It's been a slow start. We did see a 30% growth last year, but that only took us to 73,000. If you could actually maintain that 30% growth every year for the next 5 years, you'll just about get to your 300,000 by 2030. there's no doubt that range anxiety is the underlying sort of concern for motorists. And clearly it's fine if you've got a drive and you've got a garage, you can charge your vehicle at home. But if you live in an apartment, or if you live on a terraced housing on a street, then it's an entirely different concern. And people, I think, just have to be... In an ideal world, you need to get to the point where you know that charging up your vehicle is going to be as easy as it is today to go and fill it up with petrol. And so investors are going to need to be making very significant changes to their main service stations. And their dilemma, of course, is if I make this investment too soon, am I going to be caught out because I've got an asset which is stranded, in a sense, because not enough people are using it to charge their cars up. So it's a chicken and egg situation. I think where government has to be very alive is how to make its interventions in the best possible way to support that investment. And that's again is a risk. You'll be accused of doing too much money too quickly, or too little money, or too much money too late. And that can only be really, I think, addressed at the end of the day, Julia, and have a view on this, by the degree of sort of discussion, collaboration and understanding that goes on between the private sector investors who are going to put this stuff in and the degree of public support. We've seen on the rollout of fibre that the government's willing to support in the hard-to-reach areas or the uneconomic areas for the providers of fibre for our broadband systems. The same approach clearly needs to be taken, I think, with EV charging. I mean, the amount of money compared with the tens of billions which are invested each year in road and rail that needs to go into EV charging is quite small. And the other factor is the distribution networks.
Well, that was going to
and the distribution network and the reinforcement of distribution networks is another key factor. We've done some work on that recently. You get different views from different suppliers of the distribution networks. They feel they're coping reasonably well at the moment. Yes, maybe you are, but we need more investment now if we're going to be in the right place in 3 or 4 years' time for the quantum of electricity that's going to be needed, whether it's by data centres, EV charge points, or indeed our housing as we switch away from natural gas to heat pumps, which is pretty well inevitable now.
Okay. Thank you. My final couple of questions is about the future of your roles. The National Infrastructure Commission is going to be morphed into the National Infrastructure and Service
Transition Authority.
Transition Authority. How do you think combining those, the strategic oversight and delivery under NISTA helps address some of these infrastructure challenges?
Well, I think I've already suggested today that the bit that's missing is the bit in the middle.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to have a strategy, it's one thing to understand what are the best delivery mechanisms for actually delivering contracts. What's the connectivity in the middle is government development of policy. Right. And that is, as I've suggested also, it's not easy, but without that development of policy, which enables projects to then be taken forward because the right policy framework has been put around it. So I think the challenge for NISTA is the degree to which it's able to help government across departments in that challenge of policy development.
Okay.
I think if I might say as well that there is a holistic element involved in this, that certainly with the recommendations there is a tendency to the siloing of those recommendations. I mean, we see it even in road and rail. One of the things we've been talking about is an integrated road and rail strategy already, and having a single body that is focused on the strategy delivery assurance life cycle should enable us to make sure that we are getting a better integrated approach across all the different sectors, as well as, for example, industrial strategy and infrastructure strategy. So having a core at the middle, which has got the capacity to impact on various different sectors at the same time is important.
Okay, that's helpful. Do you think NIC has achieved what you thought it would? and any more lessons for NISTA as it emerges?
Well, people are generally quite kind about the work which the NIC has done. And the important thing of all the work which we've done has always been, is it credible? Does it stand up to third-party scrutiny? A lot of academics help us with our work, and the worst thing that can happen, of course, is you get a complete divide within the academic community, or their research is all wrong, and so on. So we've been very careful in making sure that the reports which we've published have been well consulted on with all the different stakeholders, and that they're credible and that people will support them when we publish them, and that has generally been the case. It's been satisfying that government has generally said, yes, we get that, and in the majority of circumstances said we believe we need to do that. The frustration, quite frankly, is then how long it takes to get things moving and to get things done. But I think we've done what it said on the tin as far as the work which we've carried out. It's been difficult for government necessarily to move things forward at the pace required to meet the sort of target dates which we all have in mind in the different sectors.
And if I might say as well, what the NIC has actually done is to fill something that just simply didn't exist before. There wasn't this approach towards infrastructure, but there also wasn't this approach towards longevity in infrastructure. We are looking to 2040, we're looking to 2050, and it wasn't happening anywhere else.
Thank you, that's good. So finally, what role do you think this committee can play in holding the government to account with regards to transport infrastructure?
In a sense, you're
doing that already.
Well, you're doing that today.
Yeah.
What can any select committee do other than try and sort of lift the stones and get underneath and understand what's going on in a particular aspect of our economy and the services which are provided to the citizens, and to be rigorous in its testing and questioning of what's going on and getting under the surface. That's not easy, I accept, but it's because you don't have all the resources which people outside may have. But by thinking carefully, obviously, about and getting as much understanding before you come into the committee of what the issues are and what the different opinions might be. There's no shortage of people you can call before you to talk about transport. And there will be different views at the end of the day, inevitably, and that again becomes the challenge of sorting through those different views and deciding which are the most important. What do you really value as a committee at the end of the day, and what you are trying to do to influence transport policy in the UK?
Any particular areas you think we should focus our scrutiny on?
Delay.
I
think if you can do what you can do to mitigate delays and actually get that rail pipeline we've been talking about going ahead, I think would be immensely beneficial.
That's very useful. Sorry, I interrupted you. Was that what you were about to say, or it was? Yeah, okay. Right, I don't see anybody pushing me for further questions. The timing's been excellent. Thank you very much for your evidence and your contributions. Do feel free to write to us if there's anything you feel you would have preferred to cover or cover in more detail in your answers this morning. Please do follow up in writing to the team. I think everybody's found it valuable. That concludes today's meeting. Order.